Hi, and welcome to the Just Bill Me demo. The purpose of this demo is to show you how to set up a new client, how to set up and configure the charges, how to invoice those charges, and finally print an invoice for the client. I'm going to be doing it for a brand new client that would be somebody who would be my client. That is, somebody like you who would be thinking about buying the system. All right, so we'll start off by creating a new client, and that's going to be done by clicking the New Client button. Then when the new client screen pops up, all we have to do is start filling it out. Of course, it'll be an active client to start off with. We will use charge codes to facilitate the entry of the charges. We will also not share these codes. We'll set them up for the first time for each client in this example. And we won't use invoice groups. Invoices groups are ways of grouping invoice items together in their own groups, but we don't need to do that for this type of invoice. And then finally, I'll leave the enter time select. The defaults that were selected down here were set up in advance, but you can override them every time you add a new customer or client. So I'm going to close this now. And the new client has been added. And here he is right here. All right then, so we've created our first customer, John Smith, and he's back here on the screen. Now we're ready to get some charges in. But before we do that, to make that process easier, we want to set up some charge codes. Now I've already taken the liberty of entering some because they're very important, and I wanted to spend more time showing you them than actually typing them in, watching me type. So I'm going to go over this screen. These are the 4 charge codes that I've entered for this customer. Now, I want to point out a couple things about this screen. These are charge codes, meaning that when I'm going to charge a customer for something, I pick this code, either a setup or 2 train or 3 custom or 4 reports. When I do that, it brings back the information that's in the default description, the invoice description, the default rate. It tells me the invoice, whether to show detail on the invoice, and whether that code is active and shows up in the list. So I want to go through this one by one. Another thing is it's ordered by charge code on the invoice. You don't see the charge code on the invoice, but that's how it determines when it rolls up those codes, when it rolls up those charges into one thing like setup, it comes up at the top of the invoice. And then the second area of the invoice will have the train code because it's alphabetical 1, 2, 3, 4 in the charge code. The default description is blank here, and that means that when I do enter a charge, it doesn't bring over a boilerplate or a previously defined code. I have to type it in. And that's good because I want to show that in the detail on the invoice. So these 2 require me to enter something. These 2 up here don't. They'll automatically bring that information over when I enter the charge code because I won't see it because it's rolling it up on the invoice. All right, so those are charge codes, and those are how you want to enter them and set them up. I'll go ahead and close this now, and we'll actually enter some charges for this customer. And that's over here, enter charges, and brings us up to a blank. And I'm going to go ahead and put in some dates here. Let's go ahead and click on the calendar control. If I double click it, it brings up a calendar. And I can go back a month, and I can pick a date, and it brings it back to the calendar. The other thing it can do is pick the time. Now, when it brings back a new date, it picks the time for the activity, being closest to your current time. So I'm going to leave that at 10 a.m. That seems to be a good enough time. And then when I press the tab key, it brings me 15 minutes later. Now, if I know I spent more time doing the task, I can go ahead and change that now, like that. Or I could leave it at 15 and then do the task and then come back and update it later if I'm not sure. So the next charge I want to look at is the charge code itself. And this, of course, will be a setup charge. These are the 4 codes that we set up. And if I press tab, it brings back the charge description from the charge code. The units is filled out automatically, and the rate's filled out automatically. Now the total isn't going to be calculated until I press down arrow or go to a new record. Then you can see that the total was calculated over here. But it doesn't calculate until I actually leave the record and go to the next one. Before I get much further, I want to show you this too. Down here at the bottom there's a link called Keyboard Shortcuts. And when you press that, it brings up a document that is kind of nice to know about. It shows you the keyboard shortcuts that you have available on the screen. And those keyboard shortcuts, those keys are at the top of your screen, F4 for instance, or press the down arrow. In that case, it creates a new row. F5 is in the date field where I was a minute ago, or I can double click it and it brings up the calendar. If I'm also in a date field and I press Control plus or Control minus, it subtracts 1 day or adds 1 day to the date. So now I'm ready to continue. My next date will be, I want to make this 1 day later, so I'll do Control plus and same time and the same time again. And we only spent a half an hour there. And it was on a setup. And you can see it calculated 0.5. Press the down arrow. Do another one. Press F5. We'll press the 6 this time. And we'll go back and do it a little earlier. Go back to 8 a.m. And we'll spend an hour doing that. And what we're spending an hour doing is training. New one. Then we'll do some customization. So we'll go back to our calendar control. And we did this back in January on the 11th. Started at 8 o'clock in the morning. We did it for an hour. And press the 3 and it brings up custom. Now here's where we have to define what we did here. So we'll say customize invoice. Okay, and it'll calculate everything for me. And we'll do another customization here. Let's do it on the same date and started at 9. Notice how the end date was carried over to the start date on the next task if it's the same day, which is nice. And we'll press a 1, which brings us to the first time that has a 1 in it, 10 a.m. And we'll call this reports. I just typed a 4 and it brought up my code. And in the reports, I'm going to say we're going to add the logo, your customer logo. And we spent only 15 minutes on that, so let's go back and change the time. And done. And let's go and make one more entry here. Take it on the next day. Make it at 8. See where I pressed the number 8, it went through 8 p.m., 8:15, 8:30, and then back to 8 a.m. And we did this for an hour, so we'll do 9. And reports. And we made some additional changes to your invoice. And that is good. So I pressed up arrow, I can see everything's calculated, and essentially that's it. I'm done. You can see at the bottom, for each day that you're on, it summarizes the number of entries and the total amount in dollars for each day. And when you close it, and you go back and look at the screen here, it shows you all the different statuses for this customer. For instance, they're 195.50 in unbilled. This month they've had 178.50. This year 229. That's because I was entering some other stuff in here earlier. All right, so that's how you enter charges. So we've entered a new customer, charge codes, entered some charges, and now we're ready for the next step, which is to invoice those charges. Well, okay, great. So invoicing charges is pretty simple. All you do is go over and click the button, Invoice Charges. The next screen presents you with some options. It first shows you a list of all the unbilled charges that exist right now for this customer. If you click on the first one, you can go to the right here and press one of these buttons, and it'll copy it over to the starting period. Go to the last one and click the period end. It'll copy it over there. And then over here, you can click this date for today's date, or leave it whatever the last date is. Then you can put in notes, click Update. It'll show you what your total invoice is going to be, how many units there were, how many charges there were, and then you're ready. Click the Create Invoice button, and it'll tell you that it's created an invoice, gives you the number, and close the window. That was easy. And the last step is nothing more than to print the invoice. So to print the invoice, you just go to Manage Invoices, and you'll see all the invoices that have been created for this client. And of course, there's only one right now. Now, it's going to be typical that you may have received a payment for that invoice in advance. So in this case, we'll go ahead and receive that payment now and apply it to this invoice. Click Payments, tab over, put in the amount, payment code. Let's say they wrote us a check, and it was check number 453. There you go. And click Close. And you'll see we received a payment of $178.50, and the balance on the invoice is now 0. Go back, print, manage invoices again, click Print, and you have the option of either emailing it, and here's what will be in the email, or printing it, and then printing it on your printer and mailing it. So we'll go ahead and go this route. And lo and behold, there's our invoice, ready to print and mail to the client or hand it to them. So that's really all there is to it. Now, if you still think all of this was too much work, that is going through and adding a client, entering charges individually, invoicing the charges, and then printing the invoice here, and you just have a real quick charge you want to send out to a client, then you've got this other option down here called Quick Add. Quick Add's nice if you just have a new client that's never been in the system before. You've got a charge that you want to put on an invoice. You want to create the invoice right then and there. And you want to apply a payment. If you do all that, fill out this one screen, it'll skip all the steps that you've done before, go right to creating an invoice for a brand new client, and you can just go and manage invoices and print them, and you're done. It really doesn't get much easier than that. But again, it's limited. You don't have all the capabilities of adding multiple charges or doing some of the other fancier things that the normal process offers. But it's nice to have this in your back pocket if you need it. So that's just Bill Me. I hope you enjoyed the demo, got something out of it, and found it useful, and maybe are thinking about using it yourself. Thank you, and have a good day.